Welcome to the ADDA, where curious minds gather for deep, intentional conversations that spark new understanding. I'm your host, Deepa Mirchandani, founder of the Deep and Meaningful consultancy. Much like an ancient salon or an Indian ADDA, we believe the biggest challenges of our time demand more than quick takes. They demand nuanced dialogue, deliberate questioning, and a willingness to explore the uncomfortable. The ADDA is that space where diverse perspectives collide and transform understanding for a real impact. In this episode, we share space with Dr. Rana Dajani for one of our Group ADDA sessions. Dr. Dajani is a Jordanian biologist with Palestinian and Syrian heritage. If anyone was going to research the intergenerational implications of experiencing conflict, it was going to be her. We explore why she wanted to do this research, why it was so important who carried it out, and what that means for science and academia. Rana is also a multi-award winning social entrepreneur and an affecting collaborator, as you'll hear. From India to the USA, across Europe and the UK, we had a small group of people come together to talk about epigenetics and trauma and get into understanding what it will take to really decolonize our education systems. We only share publicly the conversation of Dr. Dajani and myself. Our group discussions are deliberately private, but you do get a glimpse of the topics we covered in Rana's responses. We really hope you enjoy this ADDA session. This is probably the longest title I've ever called one of these sessions. We called it The Inheritance of Trauma, Genetics, Intergenerational Resilience, and Decolonising Science. What I would like to open with is where you see the intersection of these different things when we talk about trauma, genetics, intergenerational resilience, and decolonization of science. And where do you think the sweet spot is, and why is that the place that excites you?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to be part of this discussion. And this is very unique and special. And that's what excites me, first of all, that we're having this conversation where it's open and honest and maybe uncomfortable, as you said, which I think we need to be sometimes to grow. To me, it's how do you challenge your big feelings? My granddaughter talks about her big feelings when she doesn't know how to handle them. I think we all go through these big feelings, and it's good to be able to express them, deal with them in public, to help us grapple with them internally. And maybe my other comment, what I love about ADDA is that this brave space, not safe space, brave space, that we can come and talk and discuss and share. Your question is very important. And I always like new questions that make me think outside the box and not the traditional, like, what do you think about this? For me, the intersection that gets me excited between genetics, trauma, resilience, and decolonization is that how you arrange these parts and their relationship to each other has always been imposed upon us by a particular framing from the West, the colonizer, the global North, if you will. Again, I challenge all that terminology. To me, I want to take them, juggle them up, and put them forward in a whole new perspective that draws from my culture, my religion, my upbringing, my part of the world. And that's the sweet spot, that new, it's like when you throw a kaleidoscope, you shake it and then a whole new arrangement happens. And that's how I look at it. And that's what's exciting, like what's going to come up. And if I look at it this way, what new dimensions will I discover, me and others, once we rearrange them in this new way to look at the world? So that's why I like to look at it. Now, the way I see this new kaleidoscope version is that everything we talk about, those terms, genetics, trauma, resilience, or others, are all part of who we are as organisms. I'm a biologist. So I look at us as organisms, meaning we don't live in isolation ourselves. We live part of a society, but not that. We live part of an ecosystem of other organisms on Earth. But not just that, we're also part of a continuum. Life has existed for millions upon millions of years on Earth. And so we're also part of that time component, time dimension. And I think all of that together makes me look at all those terms and think, wait a minute, what is trauma? And if trauma is being uncomfortable, then we've been experiencing trauma all throughout our lifetimes, throughout millennia. What does that mean? And the last point is these are not in vacuum. They're all connected to biology, meaning my genetics, because that's how it's transferred from generation to generation, or experienced from generation to generation, which challenges the concept of genetics, destiny, nurture versus nature. Again, a binary. Oh, I hate binaries, right? So it's a continuum. So how do we unpack that to find the intersection of those, where maybe I will briefly summarize that we are creatures, organisms who have diversity on a spectrum of change. So how does that play out in time and space within the biological ecosystem we live in? So to me, that's the sweet spot that I want to unpack and throw that kaleidoscope every time and see what comes up.
But then the thing is, right, with epigenetics, and I have to admit, I didn't know much about epigenetics, but our environments shape our genetics. So you can be influenced by a multitude of different things, which can be the pollution in London versus socioeconomic factors, dietary factors. So all these externalities can influence our genetics. So when it comes to conflict, it would seem natural to me that if I am experiencing conflict and sustained conflict, then that's naturally be a factor on my biology. And being a woman, the biology of the generations to come. So when we talk about trauma, is it as important as the environment?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, trauma is the environment,
Is the
right? It's
environment, but
part,
you know what I
right.
mean? But I mean, in terms of comparative to other factors that are constantly variable and are constantly shaping and changing my epigenetics.
Yeah. So first of all, you know that everybody here is going to be changed because of this conversation. So another disclaimer, if you want to leave because you want to keep your genes unchanged, you probably should leave. But even this conversation is going to change things. What it is, I don't know. What extent, we don't know. Nobody knows yet. But we know that we are a product of the interaction of both in every little aspect, from a hug and a kiss to the trauma you're talking about. Now, again, the word trauma needs to be unpacked, because trauma is also very relative and is different from person to person, not just by the factor of what is the trauma you're exposed to, meaning you're exposed to watching a massacre live, you're scared for your life, versus you don't get what you ordered for dinner, right? What does that mean to you? It's very relative to who you are, relative to the environment you're living in, right? So it's not a one equation that you could just say, oh, I cannot define it. And I think that flexibility, that agility of how we define trauma is very, very important. Who defines it, right? Who gets to define it, I think is important. That kind of touches on decolonization. So is the colonizer defining what is trauma from their perspective and imposing it upon us, so they can play out the narrative of we are victims because of the trauma they imposed, which gives them another leverage to come and save us from the trauma that they gave us, so they can keep on controlling us. So see that narrative, that cyclic narrative that keeps us in place, because they control the definition, they control the narrative. So really, it boils down to language and narrative.
Just about to say, that sounds like we've got a massive language problem.
Absolutely. That's why we need to redefine terminology using our definition, our perspectives, and not to shy away or to think, oh, they must know more than us because they've been in this field as scientists or scholars for a long time. No, this is science, and scholarship was made by the West. And so it's not the only knowledge available. There is so much knowledge and wisdom and scholarly work in different languages from different parts of the world that nobody has drawn upon enough to come and define any term or any concept. And today we're talking about trauma. So we need to suggest new terminology, new definitions, new perspectives and it's all about framing. When you come from a particular framework, you see the experience of trauma in one way. When you come from another framework, another perspective, you see it totally differently. Up till now, when we talk about trauma in academic, political circles that claim knowledge, all one frame, one lens. And once you try to introduce another lens, it's considered either they cater to you and consider it as a nice sugar on the top. So they're doing lip service to you. They really don't consider it because it's not published in English. It doesn't have a citation in a journal. So any knowledge is only 200, 300 years deep because it was written in English. Anything older than that in another language is invisible. So how much are we losing on what it means? Now, this opens it to everybody. This is not just a question for me, what you're asking. This is a question for everybody, all our people here. How do they define trauma? But to look at their own definition, not to regurgitate something they've read, written by someone else. And we also need to be aware, it's not just the Western scholars. Unfortunately, many of us who are not Western have adopted the Western terminology framing. That makes it worse because we kind of put on it from the global North and give it more legitimacy. And that's a disservice. So we need to be bold and talk about how we think about.
But there's something about this validation from an academic perspective. So I'm completely allergic to this, like you. So it gets my back up. I think that from ancient cultures and ancient practices, this kind of validation of, well, yoga must be doing something because a university in America says that it has effects. Or I was reading something on neuroplasticity and the body and introspection. And it's a woman in California is looking at validating Vipassana. I was like, the Buddhists haven't looked for anybody to validate Vipassana for centuries. So to me, that seems nuts and it gets my back up. So my point with all of this is the fact that we have to decolonize our own mindsets about where the validation sits. And I think it's super hard for academics from other parts of the world who want to get their research funded or want to, you end up playing a game as opposed to claiming and what the dignity, the respect, and the acknowledgement for the wisdom that people hold. So do you feel like we're at the inflection point where scientists or people with this knowledge are happy? And is the funding going to follow that?
So I think, well, today, I think we are at an inflection point because of all the hypocrisy that has been visible with all the political and geopolitical upheaval and conflicts around the world. I mean, point in case is Gaza and the response of, I'm not going to talk about the politics, I'm going to talk about the scientists and academia. The response to that has been so one-sided, showing clearly what matters and what doesn't, when honesty and academic rigor is important, and when you can put it under the carpet and go forward without it because of political issues. So I think that is the silver lining, is that it's good we are seeing it. So this infantilization with the West is melting away because we see the hypocrisy and the double standard. And once you are inside those institutions, those big institutions, the ivory towers of the West, you realize that they're just normal people like you. They just have more space to talk. They have more confidence in talking about their ideas. And the world believes what it is for what it's worth just because of that. If we had the same confidence and spoke loudly about what we do without caring about anyone else, claiming we know everything, we would shift the narrative as well. But you put your finger on it. It's about decolonizing our own minds to start with. I think that's where we need to start, and meaning building confidence in our own dignity and our own self-worth, that we have things that are worthwhile. Now, and as you said, it's usually really simple stuff that they go create a whole study around to prove a simple thing. And like I said, because of what's happening today in Gaza and other parts of the world, we now have the evidence and the proof to decolonize our minds and think, wait a minute, I can do as good as anyone else. I don't need anybody's approval, because look at them, they're all hypocrites. They're not, they don't follow what they say. So no, I can do it. So I think we are at an inflection point to actually go forward and do things. Maybe the other point I'd like to add to that, what allowed me to step out and say that without being intimidated by academia or funding and so on. I think also this is a silver lining. I'm in the global South. I'm based at a university in the global South. We don't have funding from the West to start with because we're not eligible in many cases. So when we say what we think, we're not losing anything. And that's a good call because we need to depend on ourselves for funding. And we see it today in the international NGO and the humanitarian development sector, where funding has been cut from the West, which is terrible. But you know what? It's good. It's time for us to wake up and depend on ourselves and stop catering to that cycle of dependency that has been created by the West or the global North, on one hand. And on the other hand, because I'm an academic, I'm a biologist. And because I'm going actually cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary, trying to understand how our mental health is a manifestation of our biology, I'm stepping into other sectors. And when you step into a new sector, first of all, you get to ask questions because you're new. right? And that challenges the dogma that all the people who are in mental health have grown up and say, oh, you can't do this, you can't do that, that's the limit, this is what X and Y said, and you can't, if he did, and these are usually he is a white male guy who did it decades ago and nobody's questioning them anymore. I'm coming in totally naive, so I get to ask all the questions, and I'm a scientist, so I have the rigor and the backing, let's say, and I question everything, and I have nothing to lose because I'm a biologist, and that kind of research is going on. And that's how I start picking holes, seeding some doubt. As a scientist, is all about doubt. Scientists, we have to be doubtful of everything around us, but we tend to forget that at some point, and our ego gets in the way. So I think that helped me also to challenge all this because I had nothing to lose. And you know who's the real free person? It's somebody who doesn't have anything to lose. The people in Gaza are truly free. The people in Yemen are truly free because they have nothing to lose. So I think we need to think, when can we be truly free? Then we can actually do what we want and think how we can and how we want, and we will change the world that way.
So ultimately, that's showing up with curiosity and that being the guide for you. And I'm really interested in how all of this fits into legitimately wanting to look at Syrian women and 3 generations of Syrian women and feeling like actually this is something that should be done and being led by Arab women and Arab scientists. And how does that shed a different light? I'd like for you to talk about the research as well, but as you're coming into this, as you've been talking about this academic lens, it feels like a massive validation and a legitimization of the research itself because of who it's done by.
Yes, very much so. So most of the research that is done, usually it's driven by the global north or the west, right? And a Western scientist sitting in his or her ivory tower thinks of a question, and then because of what they've read in the news, and then they fly in or contact somebody from a global south and invite them to participate, collaborate. And then they go in, they collect the samples, go back, write up the article. Maybe they'll add them as a co-author or not. Nobody ever shares the results back with the original community, and then they get all the claim and fame. For us, it was different because I'm from the community and I'm a scientist. So I know the community enough to know all the history, and I have the trust, but also I'm a scientist. So I know to ask the right question, that the question may occur to somebody in the West, but they wouldn't even know how to answer it, which is the question I tried to address, which is, can trauma experienced by one generation be transferred across to multiple generations? That question has been on the table for a long time, but nobody's been able to answer it. There have been associations trying to connect it to some health outcomes, but nothing genetically the way we have done it. We chose maternal because it was easier to get samples from women, and we could address the question of when a woman is pregnant, you have a time slot that's very clear. For a man, if you're going to take a sample, you don't know when it was embedded, when it happened, when the conception actually happened. So you have more variables. There's so many questions to ask. And as a scientist, you need to choose the question where you can, at least in the design, guarantee some form of specific answer that is accurate as much as can be. So we chose each scenario, what is the least variables in the system, so we can have an accurate answer. So we chose the maternal, a pregnant grandmother during the trauma. We brought her daughter in and her 2 granddaughters, one born before the 2011 trauma and one after. So it was very intricate design. Bringing in why we were able to even imagine such a design, it's because of the intricate knowledge of the society and the history of it, which if you're not from the global south or from that particular community, you wouldn't even dream of doing it. And then knowing the science enough to know what are the nuances of the design, right? Why we need 2 granddaughters, why one born before 2011, one after, etc. And then we had the 3 cohorts, one where the grandmother was exposed to the massacre in 1982, one where the daughter was exposed in 2011, and one where the whole family lineage was actually outside of Syria way before 1982.
It's really specific. So the sample pool, it's very tight.
Oh, it took us 7 years to find these families, enough numbers of families per cohort that fit exactly those criteria. It took 7 years, and of calling, contacting, putting social media contact, advertisements. It was all volunteers. These women were volunteering because they cared. They wanted to know what's going on in their bodies and their offspring. And they trusted me because my mom was Syrian. Many of those families after 1982 massacre came and lived in my home in Jordan, where I live. They spent coming out of the massacre, running away after seeing it with their own eyes, the horrendous things that happened to their loved ones, they stayed in my home and I was a teenager. So I remember that very, very well. And I think it's that trust. It's like, okay, we know Rana, she's going to do this. She's one of us, we want to know what's going on. And that's very important. But I also want to answer your question. I think it's very important to raise this, is that I couldn't do it all alone, and nobody can do science alone. Science is no longer a one person show. It's a team. And as much as I would have loved to have my team all Arab, we don't have enough people from our communities who are experts in different fields, or they may be and I don't know them. So either they don't exist or they do, but we don't communicate enough. We're not visible enough to know each other. So I reached out to the people I know who are experts. For example, when I at the university, who's an anthropologist, and I invited her and said, could you come and help me? How do I measure trauma? Right? Because it's like from a social perspective, experience-wise, not a biology perspective. And she brought in her funding to do that. And she was responsible for that. So I gather my team and everybody comes in with their own funding, their own interests, but I'm leading it. So I interrogate everything that's coming in to make sure that it follows my culture, my values, and so on. Then I needed, okay, so we collected the samples and I had another young researcher who is Syrian, who was actually going house to house, talking to the people, gathering the information and the samples. We took cheek swabs to gather DNA samples. We didn't do more than that. That's why we never connected this to health outcomes. But then I needed, after I got DNA, I needed to analyze the DNA, which is expensive. And therefore in Jordan, I don't have that expensive equipment or the continuous funding to keep doing it. Again, I looked out for a collaborator and I invited Connie Mulligan from University of Florida to join me so she could get funding she applied and got funding to actually analyze the samples in her lab with her team. So it was a collective effort of everybody doing their part, but the idea was initiated by me. Now, this is very different than usual science done. And actually, it ran into a kind of a misunderstanding when it was published, because when it was published, in a publication, so we're talking about academia and how you disrupt academia, you have the whole list of authors. Every discipline it does the order of authors in a different way. So like in business and economics, they do it by alphabetical order. In the social sciences and humanities, the first author is the senior author. In biology and life sciences and basic sciences and physics, the senior author is the last author. All right. So for those who don't know, they may assume things. So for us, for this paper, for example, I was the last author because I'm the one who came up with the idea, and therefore I'm senior in that position. Connie, who did most of the epigenetic analysis in her lab, was the first author. And so some people assumed that because she was the first, that she was the one who came up with the whole idea. And there was a misunderstanding, even not just from the West, actually from the global South as well, saying,
it's a mess.
Yeah, so they said, oh, this American scientist discovered epigenetic signatures in Syrian refugees. What? No, it's not like that. And we had to call, and it's like, why would the Arab outlets see it that way? But I think that's part of that colonization. It's like they would never assume it could be somebody local who came up with the idea, because that's the stereotype we have in all our minds. And that's why we need to decolonize our minds and say, of course it has to be the Arab person, not the American person who came up with the idea. So again, that's an example. And since then, we've kind of come together trying to portray the true story of what happened. And I think it's important so that we encourage others to think it is possible. Even if I don't have money, right? If I have a very good question that everybody's curious about, people will come to you. That's why it's about how you design, how you ask the question, how you have the confidence. And by the way, when I came up with this question, people, even those who I partnered with said, Rana, you're crazy. It's not going to work. And it was me who insisted, no, I know it's going to work. You got to trust me and let's do it. And finally, it's like this big splash. So having confidence in yourself is very important.
I want to go into the findings and the meat of what your surprises were. But I do also want to just acknowledge, and I think maybe this is something that we will come to it later, but it is that radical collaboration piece and the radical collaborator that you are, and seeing the value in, and there's a Hindi word which is jugaad, which means to make something out of nothing, the kind of use a coat hanger as an aerial type, that kind of mentality of create something, but to have that kind of tenacity of will to say, we'll go and, there'll be people who are interested in doing this and we'll find them, but also believing that there will be people who want to work with you and collaborate with you, and that collective piece. I know that's a big part of the way that you think, but it feels like this is it in a world where maybe that isn't as frequent or encouraged because these hierarchies exist.
I mean, you touched upon very important points. I think it's all driven by intrinsic motivation. I think we've been used to a world that is based on extrinsic motivation, the carrot or the stick. And whether it's in our education systems or our workplaces, it's all based on that. So we lose our intrinsic motivation. And I think intrinsic motivation is part of our DNA. As a species, we evolved and survived because we have intrinsic motivation. And if you unpack intrinsic motivation, it's built on having autonomy. Like, I'm doing this because I want to. It's not for anyone else. It's for me, which is built on curiosity, which you mentioned earlier. This is all driven by curiosity, which is another fundamental human trait that made us survive. But then from that curiosity, that autonomy, I'm doing it because I want to, because I'm interested, comes mastery, because you want to know. You will do anything and you will go to the details and you master it, and it's great quality. That's what attracts others. Oh my God, look what she's done. And it's not for them. You're doing it because you love it, you care, and it's driven by your passion. So you make it perfect as can be. And you don't leave any detail. You don't do shortcuts because you master it. And that leads to having a purpose. So you're doing it for a purpose. You're not doing it for fame. You're not doing it for any materialistic reward. It's your own inner fulfillment that's driving everything. And I think that those qualities that are all under the umbrella of intrinsic motivation is what we need to nurture in every human being, which is bringing them back to their roots, how they survived as a species, which is present in every one of us. We don't need anyone to come and save us. We have it all inside us. We just need to trust ourselves. And so what we can do to each other is to help nurture that. We don't give it. We just help nurture it by sharing what we do with others and trusting people. Again, trusting others that they have it in them. And that will attract, as you said, that creates the radical collaborator. I like that term. But it happens organically, not by design. It's like, I'm going to become a radical collaborator. No, you just follow your intrinsic motivation and the magic will happen down the road. And I think this hype about, I have to learn it, this is the model I have to follow, all that extrinsic outward framing that I need to put myself in goes besides the point of just trust yourself. It's as simple as that. You've been around for 200,000 years. You don't need that course or that university academic credential. You have it in you. And I think that's part of the decolonizing the mind as well, and trusting yourself.
But this is something really beautiful about bringing together. And again, I think, I don't know how unusual this is, but it feels unusual to me, is the bringing together of the tangibles and the intangible. So what I mean is you bring together the scientific mind, but also a massive recognition of the intangibles of humanity and human nature, which to me is this magic combination of left brain, right brain. This is your journey, the separation that we've experienced. It feels like what you're also talking about is redressing that separation that, particularly in the regenerative world and the social change world, we talk about a lot. And it's that binary, non-binary coming together, which is where the edges exist and where the magic happens.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Any time you encounter something that gives you a binary, no, it's wrong. It's artificial. It's not natural. All nature is a continuum. It's a spectrum. There's nothing called normal. Anybody who tells you normal is wrong too. Every part of society, every variation of a trait is there for a reason.
But is that unusual in scientists? Because I think of scientific world as being quite definitive. Because I know you've done a series of articles about faith and religion and science and how those worlds come together for you. And you talk in one of them, you talk about observation in Islam. But it feels, in terms of the findings of the research, it feels like a coming together of the scientific and the non-scientific in a very real way, which feels quite unusual. So I'd be kind of interested for you to share the findings, but also speak to this non-binary coming together piece.
Yeah, you put it very beautifully. Actually, I mean, science introduced, no, I want to rephrase that. Modern science, because science has been around for thousands of years in China and the Arab Islamic civilization and in others, not to limit. But modern science in the last 200, 300 years, what they call the Enlightenment, between quotes, was based on categorization and therefore limitations and boundaries, which may have helped understand nature to a certain extent. But now, as scientists, we are realizing how limiting that is today to really understand and tackle the next level of questions or the next dimension of questions. We're hitting a wall. And the wall is because we have categorized everything, which is very artificial. Hence, we are being blind to a lot of things. And scientists all over the world in different disciplines are talking about breaking those walls, looking at spectrums and continuums. This is the new wave. But of course, like everything, it takes time to relinquish the old system. People love to, people are always reluctant to change. And it takes courage. Again, coming from another part of the world, you have nothing to lose. You can ask all these questions and challenge everything. If they don't like it, you just go publish, you write it. And you may be wrong, and that's okay too. And I draw that from my culture, that we have a saying that if you do ijtihad, which means you come up with a new explanation for something, if you're right, you get 2 rewards. And if you're wrong, you get 1 reward. So you're rewarded either way. Go ahead. That's a license, And if it's a mistake, it all depends on your sincerity. And nobody can question your sincerity because nobody knows what's happening in your mind. So again, all of these are green lights to go and ask questions, propose answers. Of course, back them up with good research, rigorous research, but don't back away just because X, Y, or Z said it's impossible. And we know that even in practical research, right? When Yamanaka, the Japanese scientist who questioned that your adult cells are determined for life ever and they can never go back to become stem cells, he challenged that dogma, which was around for decades, and he was able to reverse it. So again, always questioning, asking, not taking things for granted, which is curiosity and how we should bring up our children. I can't resist, a jibe on education. But back to your original question. So the results that we came up with, and I'm going to highlight just the main one, is that we found 14 sites that had an epigenetic change, meaning the genes were either turned on or off, that were inherited from the grandmother by the grandchild, from the grandmother who was exposed to trauma during pregnancy with the mother of the grandchild. Now, those 14 sites were, the curious thing is that they were not present in any known biological pathway that has already been identified. So science has advanced. We know many biological pathways that are related to stress, anxiety, different diseases, or some common like cell growth, nothing. All right. So these 14 sites are not there, which makes me think, first of all, that doesn't mean they're connected to anything necessarily, mental health, stress, et cetera, because they're not popping up in all those pathways, right? On one hand. So that's number one. Number two, usually when they're not popping up, that means, and therefore we don't know their function, they must have something to do with higher regulation of other processes downstream that we don't understand. So that's number two. And number three, because we're talking about, when people talk about trauma, they're either talking about mental health and stress. That's always the talk. And disease outcomes, right? We didn't collect disease outcomes, but these people are not like they're not like they're alive, they're surviving. And if it was a disease outcome, it should have popped up in any of the biological pathways. But if we go back to then behavior and mental health, we don't understand how the brain works, right? And so today, we don't even understand how it works. So if we discover a pathway or these things and nobody's discovered them before, that leaves it open because we don't even understand how the brain works. So all that collectively made me think, what could those 14 sites imply or be potentially responsible for? Of course, this is speculation because we don't have the data to support it, but we can, by elimination, say it may be this. And I looked at other animals and other organisms in the tree of life because we're part of the tree of life. We don't exist in a vacuum. So we looked at other organisms that are similar to us in terms of living in complex environments. So an organism that lives in a complex environment like us and highly intelligent is the octopus, by the way. And the octopus, if you look into its DNA, and this was like by coincidence, it was published while we were doing our work, that they have huge changes in their regulation of their genes, much more than other creatures, because they are highly sociable and they live in complex environments. Oh, highly sociable, complex environments. That's similar to humans. We're very sociable. That's another reason we survived, by the way, not because we're smarter. We survived because we're social creatures. We need each other. And we live in complex environments, and we have a lot of epigenetics. So that made me think maybe those 14 sites can be, again, I'm proposing a framework. And my proposal is as good as anyone else's. Why not? And it challenges the status quo. Why not? If I err, I get one reward, and if I'm right, I get two. And what I proposed is that these 14 sites are part of a system that when somebody's exposed to trauma, they pass it along, these changes, they pass it along to their grandchildren. So they have more adaptability and flexibility to deal with an unpredictable environment in the future. When we talk about adaptability and predictability, we are removing the binary. So it's not that, oh, they experienced trauma, they're victims, all these negative pathways are turned on, and how are we going to go in and save them years later? All right. So it challenges that. No. And it also doesn't put us in the other binary, which is, oh, you're heroes, you're resilient, you can do anything, which is another kind of pressure. Not everybody's a hero. I want to, sit with myself and be sad sometimes. So it removes the binary, and it says these 14 sites may turn on adaptability. So as the offspring are born, they have a whole spectrum of what they could do. So there's agency in there. It's that play between nature and nurture, which is also another binary we don't want. It's about how I adapt. And so I have inherited the capacity to adapt because of what my grandmother was exposed to. Not to mention, we've been exposed to trauma since humans have evolved 200,000 years ago. This is not new. And not that I'm celebrating trauma. We need to hold the perpetrators accountable. We need to stop the violence. We need to stop arming Israel. But since it happens, and it will happen, we have survived. So we're not all victims today, 200,000 years later. There are some who are not victims and claiming everything is fine in the global north. So why should we be playing into that? And now I have the biology to say, hey, maybe those 14 sites can give us the biological basis to say we are adaptable and we're not in any box. For those who don't like it, this is a challenge. Go, challenge me, and let's work on this together to make a difference. And I get to say this because I'm a daughter of refugees. When I propose this to my collaborators, it's like, oh, because they're global north. How could we say that? That would be celebrating trauma. We can't do that. So, well, I can do it, right? And that's why we need more scientists from from us, from our communities, from the global south, because then we can say whatever we want. And we're not thinking of what others are going to think about us. So that's kind of my framing. And I gave it a quote: from victimhood and vulnerability to agency and adaptability. And I called it my grandmother's wisdom.
As we entered our group discussion, there was a lot of information and feelings percolating within. We'd exposed the biases of Western science and academia, whilst also calling out the need for each of us to step into challenging ourselves and the norms that we follow somewhat blindly, it seems, in order to be curious, seek out our own truths, and to question the status quo. The reflections and questions that came up in our group discussion further delved into these themes, and we explored the power dynamics within our assumptions, the embodied wisdom and medicine of our ancestors in preparing us for stepping into taking responsibility for the collective good, and we also got into exploring trauma more deeply, what it is, who gets to define it, and who gets to normalize it. Our group conversations are private so that people feel like they can share openly. So what follows here are some snapshots of Rana and me reflecting on what was being shared. We didn't want you to miss out on the richness that emerged. I hope it sparks curiosity in you and furthers your own explorations.
I think so many practices we know from our ancestors. I speak from my practice as a Muslim. We see it in Gaza. We call it sumud, their faith, and how they are surviving this horrendous experience of genocide. And we see it in other places, but I'm just citing the one closest to me and the most horrendous one we're living today. It makes you think of all these practices we have evolved over millennia are changing our psychology. This is biology. This is not just, and this connection between the brain function and the body, the psychology and the biology, they're all connected. It's just that we didn't understand them. So again, the binary, we separated them. We said psychology and how you think it has nothing to do with the biology. And slowly we're making those connections. So if somebody were to go back and talk about, the praying together, the body emotions, all this is triggering physiological pathways, chemicals going around in our brain, healing. if you will, if there's a better word to use, is real. It's real. It's just nobody's done a study about it, right? And maybe this is a calling, right? Can we do studies about it? But then I can also go beyond and say, do we need to do a study about it, by the way? Who said, again, that's part of the colonizer, that everything has to be academic and measured, and reminds me of, in quantum physics, if you want to measure it, you have to stop it and hold it. But as soon as you hold it, it disappears. So when we try to hold a moment in time to study an impact of an intervention, which is so innate, as you said, dancing or praying, once you try to measure it, it disappears. So maybe we shouldn't. We should just trust each other and keep going and make life much simpler. Because yes, complicated seems better, technically, materialistically, or from a capitalistic view, but maybe not. It's just about sitting together, enjoying life together, and what is more important, which is back to on what do we base value? Is it materialistic, or is it our ethics and our morals? That's the values that we need to base everything upon. And maybe lastly, you mentioned the oppressor, oppressed as a victim. These are discussions I'm having more and more today because of the results of our research and my kind of courage to talk about this publicly and challenge whatever the fallout will be, is I think that when people go through trauma, they also are falling into two boxes. Either you're a victim as a result of that trauma, so you get to stay, sit, and wait for somebody to save you, which is not healthy, or you become a bully. Oh, because of my trauma, I can do whatever I want. Nobody question me, which is Israel. And you can look at it in US politics, like, I can do whatever I want. I had trauma. Both are wrong. And none is an excuse. And they're a manifestation of a wrong framework, right? No, we're a spectrum. You went through trauma. Everybody has to be held accountable. On one hand, you can't be a bully. And on the other hand, you can't sit down and just wait for people to come to you, right? So it's a framing in our mind. We need to unlearn.
But I think, Rana, there's a third piece that's emerging. I've been to a lot of things where people are talking about the Western world needing to heal from the fact that they have committed X, Y, Z. And so there's this kind of, we all need to breathe, we all need to heal, we need to deal with our past, that we have committed X, Y, Z. So there's a lot of holding space for the atrocities committed and the kind of what can be construed as a poor me, that's my past, and I think is taking up a lot of space and a lot of noise, which I have limited patience for. I think it's rampant and I think it needs calling out at every opportunity. So
there should be acknowledgement of multiple ways of knowing. So it's okay. You could have a randomized control trial for those who are interested and who think it's important, and it may be important for certain things. It's about acknowledging that there are multiple variables, that as much as I control, I can never control anything. So keep, knowing the limitations of what you're doing, I think is very important. It's not about, again, it's not about, no, you're wrong and I'm right. It's about, okay, fine, that's one way, but we can have many ways, and then we can put them all together, and that's how we can learn better. The idea is that always we only choose one and we disregard everything else. So again, I don't want to fall into the binary. So we need to do our homework, right? So if somebody does not like randomized control trials, that means you can't just sit back on a couch and say, I like what I'm doing. You got to do the work in the way you believe in, what is better, and to prove your case, even if it's using different methodology, different ways of framing, et cetera, et cetera. But we need to do the work, because also you need to distinguish between those who just love to talk and complain without doing anything for the sake of complaining and talking. And I always say that you need to do the homework. Now, the other point which I want to comment about, which is what you talked about, certain individuals who have particular experiences that allow them to behave the way they are. First of all, these are individuals that are not in isolation. They represent a whole swath of people who are exactly the same. And I think part of the media is saying, if you could only remove Trump, everything would be okay. No. Trump is a manifestation of a bigger problem. And it's easy to say, let's remove Trump and put the problem, isolate it in one person, but the problem will never go away if you remove him, because it's always been there and actually, in a way, we want to give credit to Trump for uncovering the hypocrisy of the world. So good. But the point I want to make here is that if one individual or one sector of the community is doing something which all the collective community think is wrong, and when you say what is wrong and right, again, that's another binary. But to me, if we draw from evolution, how humans have survived for millennia. We have survived because we are social creatures, meaning we live in a community. So we don't think of individual success, we think of community success. So anybody who threatens the survival and the success of a collective community, we need to hold them accountable. And not, it's not the individual accountability. I don't cater for the individual being happy. I cater for the society and community to be happy, because that's how the species will survive. And ultimately, it will be good for everyone. So if I have somebody who has problems for whatever they inherited, okay, in general, I'm just being general, I don't cater to them. I isolate them. I'm compassionate to them. I take care of them, but I don't let them get away with destroying the whole world because they had a trauma. So I'm being compassionate as an individual, but I do not let that impact the community, because the community's success or safety or whatever the world is more important than any individual. And I think that's what we've lost sight of in today's modern society, which was why other ancient civilizations succeeded and were able to deal. Even there has always been strife. It's how you deal with it, how you deal with it collectively, how you take care of each other collectively. That's what we have lost. And hence wars have become more surgical and more violent and more non-compassionate. And so I think we need to go back to why we survived as a species and use those. And I draw from my tradition as Islam. Islam is a religion. I don't talk about the practicing people, because many people practice and it's not what the teachings are. It's about the society, the community. You take care of the community. That's your prime. And that's how you take care of everybody. And today, science is really slowly coming to talk about those terms. And I'll give you a very simple example. Now, people say, when you talk about poverty, in UNICEF or UN, they talk about one person, the child. Does a child exist in a vacuum by themselves? Of course not. So you should talk about the family. And does a family exist in this isolation? No, it's a society. But nobody addresses, for example, the big problems we have with a lens of community and family. They all look at the individual, which is never going to solve the problem. So just seeing how just shifting the focus can help us solve the problems better. Since you talked about trauma as a continuum, yes, first of all, again, who defines trauma? What is trauma is very relative to our everyday experiences as a human being. It's based on our genetics, it's based on our past experiences, how we perceive them, etc. So again, very reductionist to talk about what trauma is more extreme than another. How do you count? Do you count it? Can it be counted, measured? So I agree 100% with that. And about continuous trauma, right? So most of from what I know, of course, the mental health, when they talk about trauma, it's all about one trauma, and then they talk about PTSD, right? What happens after the trauma. When we know in our societies and communities, I talk about Palestine, it's a continuous trauma since 1948 till today, varying in degree of trauma. And who are we to judge what is trauma for anyone under occupation? Because they start normalizing what is occupation, but it's there, it's internally there. The whole point, therefore, is that we all experience different forms of trauma, and categorizing it and measuring it is not right. But if you want to study it, I think this is an invitation to think of new frameworks of doing it. We've been stuck in this Western framework for too long. I don't beg to know all the answers, but to me, this is a call for all of us to come together. Can we think of new ways of doing things based on old wisdom? That doesn't mean we're going to copy paste what happened in the past. No, we can learn from different cultures, different wisdoms, and even from today, and come up with new ways of looking at the world that can capture the complexity, that can have a holistic approach, as you so rightly said. There's so many variables. I want to go back to Western religion and the science. I think the Western example or story of their conflict with religion and ancient wisdom, if you will, from their Western culture had a problem. Yes, Galileo was stopped because of religion and hearsay and all that story. But the problem is that that story is imposed on every other culture, that we all must have problems. And that's why we need to relinquish our religion, relinquish our culture, just like the West did, so we can be free. That's called the culture myth. It can be applied in science, I have a whole different story from my culture, where in Islam, it told us if you want to be a good Muslim, you have to ask questions. You have to be curious. You have to challenge the status quo. You have to use your mind. And that's why during the Islamic civilization, we had all the discoveries that today's modern world is based on. So actually, in that context, religion was helpful and actually supported science. And so to take the Western story narrative and impose it on everybody else is very dangerous. And that's why I call it out. Not that there in other cultures, there are different narratives. So it's about being open. It's about listening to everybody and not taking one framing as the true one. I just wanted to highlight that to your question. But I am guilty, as you said, in our research, what we did with the 3 generations, we tried to be as reductionist as possible to identify those 14 sites, right? And then we're using them, but we're playing into the game. We're playing into the game using their tools to show that there's another way. And maybe, like you said, we need to stop playing the game. I agree. My children, that's what they tell me. They tell me, Mama, you should stop playing the game. I always have an excuse why I'm playing the game. And I think it's time maybe we stopped playing the game and are honest with ourselves and come up with something totally new. It's a continuous journey from generation to generation that we will always have new questions to ask, new problems to think about. But and that's what spurs us, gives us the reason to be alive, the spice to wake up every morning, to think, I want to go try to answer that question. And then realize I have 100 million other questions after I answered that one. And to be humble, to acknowledge that I'll never discover everything. And I should never think I can. Because once you think you can, that means you've lost the wonder, you've lost the curiosity, and you're stuck in an ivory tower thinking I know everything. I think that's important. And if we today, you're talking about, well, how about these people who are behaving in this way? I think they're always in a population, you always have a variation of traits, and you always find people like that in every community, in every population. And the idea is suddenly these people are more of a majority, and that's because, not because of genetics, they're always there. It's because the systems of how we frame value is favoring those kinds of people, right? It's not that their genetics is making them more common. And so rather than thinking of how am I going to fix their genetics, that's holistic, it's the environment. We should be thinking how we reframe our value system that is more inclusive of everybody. And hence, when I talk about value system, thinking of the collective good. And once you think of the collective good as the basis of value, right, then those people who are at the extreme spectrum will start dropping off. It's a thing that the materialistic system is favoring them today. So they appear to be the majority. So it's about reframing the question rather than how do I fix them? How do I fix the system that favors the collective? And then everybody will fall in their place, in the right place. And that diversity is important. You'll still have a little bit of those. That's okay to keep challenging us, to keep us moving forward. But it's not about trying to go in and fixing people, because it's a continuous interaction between every part of the system.
I want to say thank you so much, Rana, for sharing your wisdom. I get a thrill every time I talk to you. So it's been an absolute treat to share you. So I want to say thank you.
Thank you, everybody. This is fascinating. I've learned so much from the different questions and perspectives. So you have enriched my experience, and I've been changed. And hopefully together we'll make a difference in this world. And it all starts with small things. So thank you, everybody. And Deepa, thank you very, very much.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode. If this conversation sparks something in you, don't let it end here. Share this episode with someone who needs to hear it. Or better yet, gather your people and dive deeper into these ideas together. The world changes one meaningful conversation at a time. If you'd like to join one of our Group ADDA sessions, keep an eye on our website, which is www.deepandmeaningful.co, or sign up to our monthly newsletter and be the first to know what's coming up. The world really does need more people willing to think better together. The ADDA is brought to you by the Deepa Meaningful Consultancy. Production is supported by Ana Amreen and Gonzalo Diaz at Efecto Colibri, and our music is from the song Unreasonable World by Bernard Schimpelsberger.